It wasn't long before the automatic bell ringing device became something else entirely. Because, take the same mechanism, add a face and a couple of hands, and you get a clock. In fact, the word clock comes from the German word Glock, which means bell. And this clock houses the Big Ben bell, which has been telling time to Londoners for 150 years.
Today, time rules our lives. And not just the obvious things like airline timetables and television schedules. Clocks are the heartbeat of our digital world. Whether it's the atomic clocks that synchronize international stock exchanges and cell phones, or the satellite-based clocks that tell our cars' GPS exactly where we are. Yet back in the 14th century, time as we know it was a startling concept for people whose lives had been governed by natural rhythms, such as summer and winter, darkness and light.
As mechanical clocks spread from church towers to town centers, time becomes fundamental to people's lives, with benefits right across society.
So where have we got to in the story of the construction of the Boeing 777? We began with the introduction of the water wheel, an invention that helped create the wealth behind the building of giant cathedrals, whose need to coordinate their bell ringing led to the invention of the clock, a technology that was about to start a global revolution. "600 years ago, sheep were one of the most important commodities in Europe, reared not only for their meat, but also their wool. And I'm about to learn the age-old craft of separating the raw material from its owner."
So is there anything you can do to keep the sheep calm?
Well, it's just handling it correctly, really. It needs to be sitting comfortably.
And that's comfortable.
Yeah.
Okay.
My feet are both sort of underneath it.
And you did this whole thing, it's like all one piece. Look at that.
Now it's my turn.
Now what we're going to do is tuck him up. So put your knee into him.
Yeah.
Turn him over. Sit him on his bum. That's it. Higher you go, the better. That's it.
Whoa. How'd you like that? It's kind of like chewing gum and singing at the same time. In 14th century Europe, wool's big business. It's a mainstay of the medieval economy. In fact, the demand for wool was so great, watch it, that anyone that could, from the richest landowner to the poorest peasant, reared sheep. But getting the raw material, it's only half of it. Because turning this into this takes a lot of work.
First, the wool had to be washed and dyed, then spun and woven to make cloth. The problem was that production was inconsistent. What was needed was a way of getting the most out of the workforce. And that's where the clock came in.
Thanks to the clock, factory bosses are able to introduce a new concept: working hours.
No matter the season, no matter the weather, factory bosses could now guarantee that their workforce was putting in a full shift.
With the result that productivity, not just in the wool industry, but across the board, goes right through the roof. Time, like my grandfather would say, quite literally becomes money. I'm in Venice, one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and it's utterly unique. It stretches across 118 islands, not connected by roads, but by canals. And while today, tourism is the lifeblood of Venice, 600 years ago, it's all about trade.
With fixed working hours, factories became more efficient and their output increased. Soon, local markets were no longer big enough, so trade went international. At the heart of this explosion in global trade was Venice. It became a vital gateway between the East and West.
This entire place, all this amazing architecture, the gold leaf, the marble, all built on international trade.
But to cope with this explosion of commerce, one of Venice's oldest crafts had to undergo a revolution.
20 minutes of this, and there's, what, 4 pieces that do this, you said?
4 pieces.
For centuries, boats were built using planks of wood, held together with crude joints called tenons, like that. The problem with this is that in order to withstand heavy seas, the planks had to be extremely thick, and this made the boats not only cumbersome, but really expensive to build. But in Venetian shipyards, just like this, a new technique emerges that uses a wooden, skeleton-like frame. Now, there's loads of advantages to this. Because it uses so much less wood, it's cheap, light, and fast to build.
This same technique is still used today by Venice's gondola builders.
So this board here is incredibly thin. It's like ½ an inch. And that's because it's the wooden frame inside that provides all the strength. So this can be super light.
The result was that Venice became the boat-building capital of Europe. By the 15th century, over 16,000 boat builders were working in Venice, building this new type of craft. Before long, the Venetian fleet numbered some 3,300 ships, transporting goods around the world.
The thing about all these merchant ships sailing backwards and forwards across the globe, full to the brim with precious cargo, is that people begin to want a piece of the action.
Soon, it wasn't just Venice that was trading across the oceans. Other ports, like Amsterdam and Genoa, were also expanding their merchant fleets.
And before you know it, the oceans of the world are awash with ships of every description.
But more ships meant more of something else.
Now I've got a map here of Britain, a seafaring nation with loads of coastline. And each one of these dots tells the same tragic story, because each one represents a place where a ship sank. But if you look closely, you can see something really interesting. You see, most of these shipwrecks don't happen far out at sea, but here, close to the shore. In fact, often within a few miles of port. But these ships weren't torn apart by raging seas or, as used to be believed, by sea monsters, but instead by something far more deadly.
Rocks.
We're on Britain's treacherous South Devon coast, where, since record-keeping began, over 1,500 ships have smashed against the rocky shore. And those are just the ones we know about. But now, we're headed 9 miles offshore to some of its most deadly rocks.
They're called Eddystone, and their name is derived from the lethal eddy currents they create in the water.
We've only got a very short window of time to get out onto Eddystone, because you can only get on it when it's at very low tide. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous, because in a few hours, the tide will come in, and all that will be covered just below the waterline, invisible and deadly to sailors.
I'm gonna brave these treacherous waters to take a closer look at how this threat was overcome. The best way to actually experience the danger of the Eddystone rocks is to swim out to them.
This is incredible. I can't believe we just swam up against these rocks, which are covered in barnacles, to get up here.
It was to protect sailors from the rocks that a lighthouse was first built here in 1698.
Lighthouses are nothing new. They've been around since classical times. But building one this far out from shore, that's a different matter.
Not only is the rock extremely small, it also slopes at a 30-degree angle.
And most importantly, for most of the day, it's being battered by waves.
Little wonder that the first attempts at building a lighthouse on these rocks had been spectacular failures. It's 1755, and for almost 50 years, the second Eddystone Lighthouse is kept vigil over the rocks below. But on the night of the 1st of December, the wooden structure catches fire, quickly spreading from the top to bottom. The heat so intense that molten lead from the roof falls onto the faces of the men below. It's clear that the next lighthouse must be built not from wood, but from stone. And that's exactly what the British engineer John Smeaton was commissioned to do.
Build a lighthouse right here that would stand the test of time.
But first, Smeaton needed to solve the problem of how to attach huge blocks of stone onto a rock that's submerged for most of the day. To find out what he was up against, I've come to Imperial College London's wave facility. Experimental archaeologist Colin Richards is building a model lighthouse using the cement available to Smeaton at the time. Job done. We'll now leave it for 2 hours before subjecting it to the brutal conditions of the Eddystone Rocks.
That hurt. You see, the cement that Smeaton had in the 1750s took days to set, and they had a window of just a few hours. So the cement just washed away.
Clearly, this slow-setting cement wasn't up to the task. So Smeaton set about searching for a new recipe that would set in hours rather than days.
So how did Smeaton come up with this formula?
He knew that in Italy and the classical world, they built harbours and they built the Pantheon and structures which could withstand, a lot of aggression from water.
But this formula had been lost for centuries. So Smeaton analyzed the ancient cement and discovered that the missing ingredients were nothing more than volcanic ash and fired clay.
Basically, we've got to grind these materials down into as fine a powder as we can. What this mix does, it makes the mortar set much more quickly, and also it can set underwater, which for the purposes of building a lighthouse were perfect.
How does it do that? Because normally when something sets, it's when the air mixes and dries.
Well, there's a chemical reaction between these different elements and the lime, which isn't dependent on the oxygen from the air.
Let's make a tower. It's kind of wild making this, having actually been out to the rock. Can you imagine doing the actual lighthouse where you've got this stuff firming up on you, and at the same time the ocean's about to be coming in?
Yeah.
All right, last one.
As with the first tower, we'll now leave it for 2 hours.
Okay, so now we've got all the tank filled up. We've got our lighthouse in position. We're ready to start hitting it with waves.